Hi.
Hello again. In the last segment of In Search of Christian Freedom, Ray Franz has summarized the meeting, the special meeting of the governing body, where the decision was made 13-4 against changing the policy and re-examining the scriptures that were traditionally used. And the disheartening part, especially for Ray, seems to have been when his Uncle Fred was consulted toward the end of the discussion and gave this very unsatisfactory response about whether house to house was door to door.
Yeah.
And the meeting seems to have closed shortly after that with no critique really of either Fred's response or the traditional doctrine going on from a scriptural viewpoint. Now,
given the fact that he's the translator, you'd expect a more concrete reasoning given in the answer, but it's not even an answer the average witness would give.
Yeah, it seems very cynical, really, to me, when I read his response, and it seems to have struck Ray that way too. So what are they going to do? They're going to go forward, and Ray describes what they're going to do with Scripture. Here's the subhead: Making Scripture Fit an Organizational Teaching. When governing body member Lloyd Barry was assigned to see that material was prepared on the subject for the Watchtower, he voluntarily stated before the body that he would make sure that due consideration was given to the information presented in the two charts of biblical evidence concerning witnessing in the four Gospels and Acts, and of the ways in which katoikon was rendered in various translations. That's the material Ray had given the governing body, which Ray supplied to the body members. He chose to write the material himself, and this eventually appeared in the July 15, 1979 Watchtower, the same issue that carried the article on Nancy Ewan, her door-to-door activity, and her 20 years in prison. It contained no consideration whatsoever of the supplied biblical evidence, nor, in fact, did it give any consideration to the basic issues involved as discussed in the governing body session.
At their beginning, the articles carried a large picture of houses with insets depicting witnesses calling at the doors, and at the bottom the words, "As did Jesus' apostles, present-day Christians, search from house to house for those worthy of receiving the good news." Thus, from the beginning, house to house and door to door were equated. Nowhere in the article was proof given that this is the case in Scripture. That side of the question was not even discussed.
The articles that followed illustrate clearly the way in which, with distressing frequency, the organization presents a slanted picture of matters to its members, suppressing all unfavorable evidence and thus depriving its members of the opportunity to assess issues fairly and arrive at a personal conclusion as to the validity of positions taken. Since no evidence could be presented that Jesus ever set an example or of going from house to house in the sense of visiting consecutive houses door to door, the focus of the first article was placed instead on his instructions to the 12 apostles and the 70 disciples. It followed the standard practice of presenting only those parts of the text that speak of searching out who is deserving, and omitting the phrases that accompany those words, such as, "Stay there until you leave," "Stay in that house, eating and drinking the things they provide," "Do not be transferring from house to house." After quoting only part of Jesus' words, the article then goes on to say, quote, "This would necessitate their going to the people's homes where deserving persons would heed the good news. In this way, those disciples would also find lodging for the night."
Note, would also find lodging. This serves to give the idea that this part of Jesus' instructions dealt primarily with door-to-door preaching, and that the lodging was something secondary, almost incidental. Yet a simple reading of the account, in this and other Gospels, shows that Jesus, after talking to his disciples about things they would need, or might think they would need, in going on a preaching tour, namely money, food, and clothing, then talked about something else they would need on their trip, namely lodging, and that this was the primary concern discussed in his quoted words. Jesus' statement immediately following, "and stay there until you leave," demonstrates this. By its quoting only a segment of the verse and splitting up the points, the article more easily manipulates the mind of the reader to acceptance of the ideas advanced.
Now there is a footnote on that page, and this is how it reads. The article also draws a red herring across the trail by saying, whether they went to the synagogues or marketplaces, the record does not say, but they were instructed to go to the houses of the people. That's the end of the quote. Ray says, this serves to divert attention from the real issue, which is whether Jesus was giving instructions on witnessing methods or was giving instructions as to obtaining lodging. The disciples already knew how Jesus witnessed, for they had been with him and observed his example. Their own accounts, such as those of Matthew and John, say nothing of his going from house to house, but do relate his speaking in synagogues, marketplaces, and other public places, and of his accepting invitations to particular homes and speaking to people present there.
Yeah. So I think that is noteworthy that he's saying they already knew how Jesus went about preaching because they'd been with him. You know, they'd been listening to him preaching, and it's always Sermon on the Mount, Sermon in the Plain, no sermon on the doorstep.
Lots of synagogues.
Yeah. He's where people are, he's gathering crowds around him.
So it's, again, very disappointing for us, but especially, I suppose, for Ray back then, that Lloyd Barry completely
ignored
his research after saying he would not.
Yeah.
This is the method of propaganda, though. I don't know if you've seen our Jacques Ellul propaganda book video, but check that one out, because the method of propaganda in any totalistic or totalitarian regime, from Nazism to Stalinism, even to Americanism, and the techniques of the Western world are all geared to propaganda. What does propaganda do? Well, it doesn't allow for nuance. It must suppress context, because what you need, as Ray Franz pointed out back in the Scottish trial earlier in this book, what you need is a mobilized army, an army that keeps marching, and you can't get the troops to march properly in step if you have a nuanced or subtle message. You must have an obvious message.
Own decisions or puzzling things out for themselves.
Right.
You have to have a simple transmission of ideas that are advanced and accepted.
What must be suppressed is context, complexity / nuance, anything that would complicate the issue for the person who you want to mobilize, or the army you want to mobilize. That's the nature of propaganda. So Lloyd has very wisely, from a pragmatic point of view, Lloyd Barry has very wisely avoided the complexities of the governing body meeting, avoided the research, and gone back to basics, which is how do we keep the troops moving. In the next segment, we move to two other texts, Matthew and Luke, where in Luke 10 it explicitly says, do not be transferring from house to house. What is the Watchtower going to do with these verses?